So we'll get started with the introductions. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming and joining us this evening. We're one of the numerous organisations that have taken a keen interest in the US election and are hosting an event tonight to talk about some of the potential outcomes of that and what to look out for, really, because obviously lots of quirks with the US electoral system that make it one of the most fascinating spectacles for us political geeks to watch and opine on. So we're very lucky this evening to be joined by Alex Wilson, who is going to start off with a very interesting presentation on some of the things to look out for. So Alex is a leading election analyst, and he's got an excellent track record of forecasting elections. So earlier in his career, he spent 3 years at the Conservative Party's in-house psychologist, and he now runs his own consultancy, actually advising a range of clients on potential outcomes and implications of electoral dynamics on their businesses and projects. And we are very, very lucky that we don't have to pay him a fee tonight, I don't think. So I'm very grateful for you giving your time, Alex, and really fascinated to hear what you've got to say to us, actually. And then after Alex, we've got a couple of our own team, Alan and Jack, who will take different sides. So Alan is going to take the side of Joe Biden, and Jack is going to take the side of the Donald, and they will put forward some of the arguments about why they think that those respective candidates will win. We're going to start with you, Alex. So again, thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much, Luke, and thank you for that very generous introduction and for inviting me to take part tonight. I'm just going to share my screen because that way we can look at the slides. Right, okay. Right, so yes, thank you very much again for that introduction. I am very much a sort of self-confessed election geek. As Luke said, I did spend some time a few years ago working for the Conservative Party in-house, sort of dealing with all their kind of internal number crunching. And since then, I've kind of developed a career in public affairs. And about 3 years ago, I set up my own consultancy. And one of the many things that I like to offer to clients, potential clients, is a really detailed understanding of elections and the dynamics that are associated with them. Obviously, for I think most of the people that are on the call tonight, we're fascinated by elections for their own sake and the politics and the sort of horse race element of it. But for clients and people who actually matter, it's more relevant for them because it's trying to understand if you're working on something that a decision needs to be taken, a political decision by political actors, you need to know in advance that you're making relationships with the right people. And if there's a chance of things changing, it's very helpful to know in advance that you might want to broaden your the relationships that you're building. Obviously did a lot of work around the general election last year, but something I'd worked on a little while previous to that, I'm quite proud of as a piece of work, was something I did on the London Council elections in 2018. And in over half of the councils, we managed to predict the Conservative Conservative seat tally within plus or minus 2 seats. So that's less than a ward. So that was a pretty good piece of work. This is the first time I've been invited to comment on an overseas election. So it's a bit of a new departure, but the American system is one that is fascinating and has lots of, sort of quirks and dynamics that lend itself to this sort of work. So let's kick off. We'll kick off by just summarising what is going on. It's a huge set of elections. Obviously, the big prize is the White House and the presidential election. Remember that they don't actually elect the president directly. It's through the Electoral College and each of the states electing a certain number of members to that. Also, just over a third of the Senate is up for election, the entirety of the House of Representatives. And then at state level, there are various governors and state legislatures and various other positions that are up. The map at the sort of bottom right-hand corner shows where sort of state level things are going on. I'm not going to comment any more about that level because there just isn't time, but it's there just as a kind of reminder that there are other things happening as well. The map on the top right is showing which Senate races are up. We start off by looking at who is defending what territory. Now, obviously, if you go back to 2016, then Donald Trump won the presidential election by virtue of getting a majority in the Electoral College. Those figures are there. As I say, a third of the Senate seats are up, and that shows the balance of those seats that are up, but also the balance of the Senate as a whole, which the Republicans currently have a majority in. And then also the House, as I said, all seats in the House are up. And since the 2018 midterms, the Democrats have held a majority there. So that's who's defending what. Then look at a bit of a history lesson. Now, because I think most of us on the call are probably Conservatives, given the organisation that we're taking part in, I thought it's nice to start with 1980 because we all should have a very sort of soft spot for the great Ronald Reagan, and looking at the seismic victories that he achieved in the presidential election. But what this is showing, this chart, is probably a little bit too busy, but what it's trying to show is all three sections of the election in every set of elections since then. So the line graph is showing, or the solid line graph is showing the House vote share, the dotted line is showing vote share for the Senate, and the bar chart is showing the vote share for the presidential election. And what we learn from this, I think, if you look back over time, then I think it's fairly reasonable to say that in terms of general partisanship, the US tends to lean towards the Democrats as a kind of default position. You have to be something quite special to win as a Republican, either as president, and remember that since 1988, there's only been one instance when a Republican candidate has won the popular vote in a presidential election, George Bush in 2004. But also to win control of the House, it's pretty tough. And throughout the entirety of Reagan's administration and George Bush Sr.'s administration, the Republicans never managed to win a majority in the House. And indeed, when they finally did in 1994, that was the first time they'd achieved that since 1952. The other trend that I think this is starting to show is that the degree of split ticket voting, I think, is reducing. And I think as the country has become more polarized, more tribal, more partisan, I think there are fewer people now that might be willing to vote for a presidential candidate of one party and a congressman of another. And you can see a kind of clustering together towards the end of this time series of how certainly the House votes and the presidential votes are looking much more closely correlated. We then look at the opinion polls as always a good place to start. Now, as part of the research for this presentation, I individually analysed and selected and found 499 standard voting intention polls, national voting intention polls that have been conducted since early June. I chose that as a starting point because that was when Joe Biden's position as the candidate became unassailable. It was no longer mathematically possible for anybody else to secure enough delegates to beat him. So in that period, this is what each individual poll has shown. Obviously, that looks a bit of a mess, so we'll put a moving average trend line in there, and it shows quite a clear trend that Biden has basically been in the lead throughout that period. So of those 499 polls, there were 3 that had a lead for Trump, 1 had a dead heat, and 495 had a lead for Biden. A slightly simpler version, just taking a kind of monthly projected average, basically just shows the same trend, but in a more kind of clean and neat and tidy and simple way. But of course, as we know from 2000 and 2016, it's not just about the popular vote. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, didn't become president. Likewise, Al Gore, those years previously. It's as with any first past the post electoral system, which effectively this is. It's not just the number of votes that matters, it's also the distribution of votes that matters. And it's about targeting the right states and getting, winning the right states so you can get that majority in the Electoral College, which is something that obviously Donald Trump managed to do 4 years ago. There are various ways of categorizing which states can be regarded as more solid or reliable for one party and which are more kind of in play. I've chosen what's known as the Cook Partisan Voting Index, which is a measure that is calculated after each set of federal elections, and it basically measures across the 2 previous cycles the extent to which each state and each district is either more Democrat inclined or more Republican inclined compared to the rest of the country. And this table has grouped those all the states and indeed the handful of individual districts that elect electoral college voters individually. It's categorised them into these groups. Now, to win a majority in the college, either side will need to basically hoover up all of the states that you would expect to be voting for them, along with those that you would hope are voting for them under normal circumstances. But you also need to kind of eat into that middle territory, and you can see the 3 states in the middle on the current version of this index. 2 of those, the largest 2 of those, were obviously 2 that Trump did manage to win. So Trump managed that process extremely effectively. He won every state that was in the either the solid, likely, or lean Republican categories, and he also ventured further into more sort of centrist territory. Those that are marked with the asterisk are the states that Trump won in 2016, but the Republicans didn't win 4 years previously. So it's basically Florida and a huge breakthrough in the Great Lakes region, in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan and that kind of territory, Ohio as well, obviously. So there are other measures available. That's the measure that I've chosen to kind of display where your sort of starting point is strong, weak, and where you need to target and where you need to make progress. I then thought I would look at a couple of scenarios for what could happen in less than a week's time. I must stress that neither of these are quite a prediction, but the first scenario I've gone with is using the 2018 midterms as a comparison. These were widely sort of touted as being a referendum on Trump's presidency so far, and there were some quite interesting results that came across in those. In fact, the Republicans did manage to increase their majority in the Senate, but they obviously lost control of the House. I've used in this sort of projection, obviously the House results just read across simply from House 2018 to House 2020, so that's very simple. I've used the House votes as a sort of proxy for voting for the president. I know it's not a perfect comparison, but it's a reasonable starting point. Where you have Senate seats that obviously not all Senate or not all states elect a senator every year. So where there is a Senate seat up both in 2018 and this year, again, it's a simple read across. Where there isn't, or where there wasn't a Senate seat up in 2018, I've used the kind of aggregate votes for the House seats within that state. I hope that makes sense. What that throws up as a projection is something like this. So it shows the Democrats, or shows Biden obviously potentially getting a clear but not overwhelming majority in the Electoral College. It shows obviously the Democrats holding on to the House because it's direct read across from the last set of results, and it shows that the Senate kind of almost on a knife edge, although with 50 seats for the Democrats. There are 2 independents who caucus with them anyway as well, so really they do have an effective majority, and that's even without having to consider whether the vice president would have to use his casting vote. But it's a narrow majority in the Senate, the same majority in the House, and a comfortable, but I say not landslide, not overwhelming victory in the Electoral College. So that's what that scenario could have looked like. Just showing it, sort of visualizing it in a slightly different way. I'm a big fan of these kind of arch diagrams to show what a kind of virtual chamber would look like, and then also the bar charts are showing the change in the composition of each of these three bodies. The states that would have flipped in the Electoral College are Arizona, Iowa, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I think the last 3 of those I think probably won't come as any great surprise. The other 2 are a bit more marginal. More interestingly, equally interestingly, in the Senate, the seats that would have changed hands on this projection for the Senate are Alabama, which actually the Republicans will be gaining back from the Democrats, but then also Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, and Maine would be Democrat gains from the Republicans. And interestingly, and I think these are a bit sort of quirky results that I think are actually very unlikely to happen, Montana and West Virginia. The second scenario, and I say this is still not an outright prediction as such, although we're getting closer to reaching one, is based on a whole variety of polling. I've already mentioned the 499 national level voting intention polls, which I've included in the analysis. I've also included 545 state level voting intention polls for the presidential vote, and that covers all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. And those are polls that have only been taken in the last month as a way of being as up to date as we can broadly expect to be. Similarly, 224 individual polls for the Senate and for individual Senate races across 30 states. Not all Senate seats have been polled in the last month. And then as a proxy for a kind of general House vote, I've used what they call the generic ballot, which is a simple Republican Democrat question that actually works quite well when I plugged it into the analysis. But then for 84 districts, there have been polls conducted within the last month or two, and I've included those as well. So a grand total of 1,480 polls have been included in this. Now, the easiest thing in the world would have been to just plagiarize someone else's figures. I could have gone to, there are various sites, 270 to win, 538, particular favorite of mine. But I thought, no, where's the fun in that? I'll as I said at the beginning, self-confessed geek, I wanted to create my own model from scratch. So that's what I've done. Let's look in particular at what this is showing going on in the key battleground states. I've identified 12 key battleground states, and this is basically what it's showing. So in this graph, I've tried to visualize both the importance of each state. So the bars going down are in proportion to the number of electoral college votes available, and the down bars are colored by which party won them last time. So all but two of them were ones that Trump managed to win, and then the upward facing bars are which party is currently in the lead according to this analysis of the polling. And you see that in these 12 states, Trump is currently projected to only be in the lead in two of them, Texas and Ohio. Then you've got a sort of cluster of some that are a bit more marginal, and then those kind of exceptional ones that where Trump had an exceptional result to win in 2016. Biden is in a much stronger position there, and I think probably an unassailable position in those states. What this also shows is that if Trump was to repeat his trick of 4 years ago, then he basically needs to hold on to everything, or near enough everything, that he won last time. There isn't the scope. If he was to lose, let's say Pennsylvania with its I think 20 electoral votes, that only then gives him a margin of 16 still in the tank, and so to lose Michigan as well, then that's his majority wiped out. But there isn't the scope to gain enough seats in other states that he didn't win. So Nevada is potentially very much in play, but it's not worth that many electoral college votes. Likewise, Minnesota, which is probably out of reach, even in a very good year. But again, even if he was to achieve that, it wouldn't compensate for losing the likes of Pennsylvania and Michigan. So what this would all then look like, again, having thrown all these polls in across the three sections of the election, what it looks like as a composition for the Electoral College, for the Senate, and for the House is something broadly like this. So this is a much bigger win for Biden. It's not really much different in the House. It's very modest gains for the Democrats in the House, but nothing particularly spectacular. They basically did the heavy lifting in 2018. And the same net composition for the Senate as the other projection would have shown. The states that would have flipped in the Electoral College, in addition to those which I mentioned on the previous model, we now include Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and the individual districts in the second district in Maine and the second district in Nebraska, which elect individually. And a much bigger swing in terms of gains and losses in the college. Again, in the Senate, based on the polling, it's a net change of 5 seats. Again, the Republicans would gain Alabama but lose Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, and Maine. The other two that make up the difference are a different two, and I think are more realistic two, and I think are basically in the toss-up category rather than necessarily being a nailed uncertainty for the Democrats to gain, and that's North Carolina and possibly one of the seats in Georgia. There's also a special election taking place in Georgia as well, just to add further sort of complication to the mix, but that's basically what this would show. And as I said, only a modest change of seats in the House, which I think leaves the Republicans actually in a pretty strong position heading into the 2022 midterms, assuming they don't hold the White House. But as we know, as I said, this is a projection based on if the polls are right. The polls can be wrong. We know that from what happened last time in the United States. We know that from what's happened in various elections of our own. I think most of us here will have been involved, or either observing or participating in some way, shape, or form in both sort of 2015 and 2017 elections. 2015, the polls didn't really point to a Tory victory, or Tory majority rather, but we got one. And the reverse obviously happened in 2017. But that's not always the case. Sometimes they do get it right. I think 2010 and 2019, both of which again were elections that I think a lot of us would have been heavily involved in, the polls were pretty much spot on. And if you want to go back further to find an example of the polls getting it wrong, you have to go right back to 1992. So I think your starting point with any election has to be a degree of caution about the polls. And understand what they are. They are a snapshot. They are not a prediction. They are a snapshot of a given moment in time right now, based on the sampling that has been done at that time. But I think you have to start with the assumption that they are more likely to be right than wrong. There's a possible degree of magnitude, and I think that can be affected by sampling. But also, I think in 1992 there was talk of shy Tories, and that's why I didn't pick up the fact that we were on course to get a majority. I think there could well be something similar with shy Trumpers, if you like. The fact that the left have basically made it borderline socially unacceptable to admit to being a Republican or to being a Trump supporter. It's almost on akin to being drink driving or whatever. I think that's vastly, massively unfair. Because the vast majority of Trump supporters are not racist bigots at all. Just like the vast majority of Conservative supporters over here don't want children to starve. But the left are very good at kind of getting these caricatures out there. And I think this election, probably more than any other, there may well be an element of this going on. And I think the polls possibly might be slightly understating Trump's position. I would say that because I want him to win. But what I generally expect to happen, I think, if we think back to that slide where I showed the key sort of battleground states, as I said, I think the overall position, the polls are slightly underestimating him. I think today's economic news will be, should be helpful for him. The fact that they had this huge and unexpectedly huge surge in GDP performance. So I would expect Trump to take Iowa. I would expect Trump to take Georgia, which, if you look at the House results from last year, the Republicans comfortably carried that state. Similarly, Florida, again, in last year's midterms, the Republicans comfortably they carried both the House and the Senate seat. So I think they're probably in a strong position to certainly hold on to those three. North Carolina and Arizona, I think, are genuine toss-ups. I really would struggle to say which way I think those are going to go. I think Arizona, obviously leans towards the Republicans, and even still voted Republican in both of Obama's victories. But the Democrats did carry the House seats and the Senate seat last year, and I think say genuine toss-up. And likewise, I think North Carolina is probably too close to call. I think the other three important states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, I think they're probably just a stretch too far this time. We've seen from the earlier slide, the Biden's lead, I think, is too big. The real achievement was winning them in the first place. Both Pennsylvania and Michigan, it was the first time a Republican had won them since 1988, and Wisconsin was the first time since 1984. So it was huge achievement for Trump to win them in the first place. I think to hold on would be, I think, a stretch too far. So what I expect the final outcome of the Electoral College to look like is something like this. So I've included, say, Arizona and North Carolina as genuine toss-ups, but everything else is as I've described. One final prediction I think I'd be quite comfortable in making is whoever does win the presidential election this year is going to take a bit of a kicking in the midterms in 2 years' time. I think that the nature of this contest has been so polarizing, so divisive, that just by the virtue of one side winning, it will trigger a backlash of sorts. Add a personal opinion onto that, I think Biden will be a terrible president. Within 6 months, there will be nuclear tests in North Korea. Iran won't be far behind, and God knows what the economy will be doing. So I think the Republicans will do very, very well in the House elections and will regain that majority in the Senate as well, if Biden becomes president. And if the reverse was to happen now, then equally there'd be a backlash against Trump, and the Democrats will do quite well in the midterms next year. I think you've probably heard enough from me for the time being. I think there's probably some questions coming in. We'll kind of see how things go from there. But thank you very much for listening.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you. I mean, it certainly looks like a very difficult map for Trump to navigate now, doesn't it? As you say, I mean, I was looking at some of the polls the other day, and as you say, I think Wisconsin and Michigan really look like a stretch now, and I think Pennsylvania looks like the only one that's potentially in play. But do you think it's a fair assessment now that this college is historically, as you say, it's almost worked in the Republicans' favor because they haven't won the popular vote necessarily, but still won the college. Do you think it is now starting to get to a point, especially if, you know, Georgia becomes a marginal state that they have to fight for rather than something that just falls in their column without any real work? If Arizona goes, obviously New Mexico and Colorado, states that George W. Bush won, now not even in play anymore. Do you think this is a map that's starting to become more and more difficult for the Republicans to actually win it, especially if those Rust Belt states, which Trump had quite a unique strategy to win last time, aren't in play in the future?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. Although I think just by the nature of the fact that the Republican strongest states are still the smaller states that effectively punch above their weight in the college, you know, the Wyomings, the Alabamas, the whatever, the system is still tilted, I think, in their favor generally. But you're right, the trends and seeing which states have moved over time in one direction or the other is, you know, quite an interesting and could be quite a worrying thing depending on which side you're on. I think one contrast that I think is particularly interesting is the sort of difference between Virginia and West Virginia, which have kind of trended in opposite directions to each other, and with Virginia being worth more seats than that's been a problem. But yeah, a lot of truth in that. I think in some ways, though, as someone who's interested in and participating in politics, I think it should be seen as a good thing that you have to fight more hard for votes. Politicians shouldn't be lazy, shouldn't be taking things for granted. Should be held to account, and should have to work to get elected and work doubly hard to get re-elected. And if they're not prepared to do that, then that's not something we should be too distressed about.
Great. So just before we pass over to Alan and Jack to give their opinions on the respective candidates, we've got a couple of questions here. So the first one is not necessarily about the college or polls necessarily, but I don't know if you have an opinion on this. So the first one is, do you, if the election's disputed, do you see the matter going all the way to the Supreme Court for a final judgment? I mean, it would be unprecedented, but then so much has been unprecedented about the last 4 years, isn't it? So
yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the legal niceties of it, so I wouldn't want to say for definite what I thought would happen or could happen if that was to be an avenue that's pursued. Although, if let's say Trump's best hope could be if you can find a way of ruling out how many mail-in ballots as being invalid. I mean, we all know our own stories from places like Tower Hamlets where electoral fraud and postal vote factories is an issue, and it is a genuine concern. It's not just something that we look at from a kind of narrow partisan advantage, but I think in this case it probably would be. I don't know whether that's something that could escalate it all this way up there. I'd look to others who have a more kind of detailed kind of legal knowledge and so on to maybe answer that one.
And another one that you're perhaps more qualified to answer is what path do you think is Donald Trump's most likely path to victory in terms of those states that are in play, and what could he feasibly win?
Yeah, I think probably broadly similar to last time. If he is to try and get back in, he needs to try and replicate and hold on to that sort of coalition of support that he had 4 years ago. I think he will I'm pretty certain he will hold on to Iowa, Georgia, and Florida, but he can only really afford to lose one out of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Otherwise, he does run into difficulties. I would like to think it's still in play. I think my preference would be for that to happen. But sometimes when we have to look at these things and we think what's likely to happen isn't necessarily what we might want to happen. There is still a path to victory, but it basically means pulling off the same trick twice. Can he do that? If you look at I think today's economic news has got to be a good thing. I think the general levels of energy and enthusiasm surrounding the two candidates is also something that I think does play into his favour. I mean, I know they all sort of joke about Sleepy Joe and so on, but it's that works as a characterization because it's basically true. Whereas Trump, he had the virus, he overcame it, he's back out on there, he's been on these amazing kind of whistle stop tour of the rallies, and there is certainly much greater energy about him, and I think that's something that will still help him. Whether that's enough to bridge the gap in the polling, I don't know, but I think it is going to be a lot closer than the polls are suggesting. It's just a question of can it be close enough to just get over the line or not? And I think on balance this time, probably not.
Okay, just one final question from me. Is self-confessed, someone that's rooting for Trump yourself this time. How would you rate his campaign and the message this time around? Because obviously last time there was, obviously over here, I think a lot of our news outlets like to latch on to some of the more eccentric moments, but actually when you drill down and watch some of the campaign videos and when his rhetoric was at its best, it was very disciplined and focused and clearly talking to a disaffected group and had consistent themes. Whereas this time, I don't know, maybe I've missed it, but it feels a little bit more, if I'm being really honest, like he's almost getting up on the stage and just freestyling and saying whatever he wants. And I don't know if that's the yawning chasm that Steve Bannon left when he no longer was a part of Trump's campaign, or whether I'm missing something. I don't know. How would you rate his campaign this time around?
I think the circumstances have been obviously very, very different from the campaign and the kind of context 4 years ago to now, and not just in terms of coronavirus. I think when he was standing in 2016, then he was very clearly able to position himself as being the outsider. I'm not a Washington politician. The whole sort of drain the swamp and against the establishment message had a lot of truth to it, and it worked and was effective because he was an outsider, he was a challenger, and he was challenging the ultimate machine politician in Hillary Clinton. He's still up against the ultimate machine politician in Joe Biden, but having spent 4 years in office, it's a bit harder to try and position yourself again as the outsider when actually you have been in power for 4 years. I think his strongest card prior to kind of February, March this year was obviously the economy. The growth rates were phenomenal. The stock market was doing very, very well. Unemployment rates across the whole section of society, and including all the key sort of minority groups, were phenomenal. And I think he could very comfortably have built a platform and a message around, the economy is booming. Don't let the Democrats blow it. Then completely, obviously, being blown off course by what's happened with the pandemic, as have governments all across the world. Although some receiving more favourable responses from their electorate than others. But I think in that situation he's been really unfortunate. But events deploy events. That's things happen in politics. A week's a long time in politics. 6 months a very long time in politics, and things happen that do blow you off course. But back to the kind of original question: why the difficulty in positioning yourself for re-election is that if your original message as being the outsider worked and chimed so successfully, and that's what enabled him to branch out into that territory that was hitherto unthinkable for places for a Republican to win. trying to replicate that a second time round when you've been in office for 4 years is got to be much more difficult.
That's interesting. Thank you for that. I think we'll probably come back to you for a few questions at the end of this, but I'm now just going to hand over to my fellow Conservative Progress colleagues. So I'm going to start with Alan O'Kelly. I hope you don't mind, Alan, to give us his verdict on why he thinks Joe Biden is the most likely to win next Tuesday. So over to you, Alan.
Thanks, and I think thanks, Alex. That was a fantastic presentation. I think it was something, putting kind of a really good frame on what we're facing on Tuesday night. I suppose calling a spade. I mean, Biden's run a better campaign in the last 6 months. The campaign is very much focused on being non-offensive, retaining the focus on making it a referendum on President Trump, allowing the Trump campaign to set the agenda and make mistakes, and has really backed away from really anything. They've made very few mistakes, and the only mistake you can actually think of was the comment he made about oil at the last debate, and that doesn't really seem to have affected his standing. I think people kept talking about, well, the race will tighten. There was lots of talk of the race will tighten after Labor Day. It'll tighten after the first debate. It'll tighten after the second debate, and we haven't yet seen that at national level. And I think that is because, and there's a really simple reason here, is that Joe Biden is not Hillary Clinton. He is by and large, generic Democratic politician who's been around for 20, 30 years. Very hard to pin down. The Trump campaign have really struggled to put a negative message on him. And there's a really simple reason. There was an excellent piece on CNN politics page a couple of days ago by Harry Enton, who's made a great point that Biden's favorabilities are, he's got positive favorabilities. People like Biden. All he has to do is convince people who already like him to vote for him. That's a very different situation in 2016, when Hillary Clinton essentially had to convince people who really didn't like her that she was the lesser of two evils, which is a very, very different sell. The last point I'll make is I think people seem to, for some reason, decided that Trump is the underdog in this election. I think it's incredibly rare that an incumbent president loses re-election. This happened twice since the 1940s. Bush, Carter, and before that is Hoover, I think. So you're talking about a very rare circumstance. Trump should have run a much better, much more bullish campaign. I think Alex, you're absolutely right. The numbers the GDP numbers are phenomenal. I think the problem has been that because there's been no story to build up to him, I'm not sure it'll have the impact with voters that it necessarily could have had. So I think the reason Biden's going to win is the reason lots of politicians win is because he's overall run a better campaign, has had a really clearer message, and I'll finish all of this by making a point. I'm not saying what type of president he'll be or how he'll govern, or whether that's a good or a bad thing. But I think when you look at what the last 6 months have brought us, I think it's hard to say that he's running other than a very good, very, very, very good campaign. Sorry, the very last point to make, I would disagree with one comment Alex made, which is around the shy Trump voters. Just don't think this is a thing. There was no evidence in 2016 that there was actually a shy Trump vote, or very little evidence. And one thing I would point out is, if there is a shy Trump voter, why in a lot of states is Trump running ahead of Senate candidates? I mean, you would have thought in many ways it should be the opposite, and that there's a bunch of Republicans who don't want to vote for Trump. So if that was the case, you would have thought the otherwise. So I think it's still winnable for Trump. I think it's really important that people get, it's not a slam dunk. A 10% chance is not nothing. It's, if you're told you're going to win the lotto 1 in 10 times, or you had a 10% chance of winning the lotto, you'd play you'd play it every week. So I think it is possible, but I just think where we stand now and where the context of the race, I think Biden has run a better campaign and will likely end up winning on Tuesday night.
Thank you, Alan. Alex, do you want to come back on that? Do you believe that there are any...
Start a row.
Fight.
You're on mute, Alex.
Sorry. Yeah, I think, let's let Jack have a go first, and then perhaps I can sort of come back in at the end and see where we are then.
Yeah, that was interesting though, Alan. I mean, it does sound like from everything you hear, Joe Biden has been a lot more cautious, and I guess the other wave that he's riding is younger voters, maybe ethnic minorities who were not overly enthused by Hillary Clinton, but now having had Trump for 4 years are very mobilised against him, aren't they, as well? But it'll be interesting to see how that translates in terms of the spread. Obviously Biden could just stack it up in New York and California, couldn't he? But we'll see. So what do you think, Jack? So do you think there is still life in the Donald? Can he pull off another shock victory? Gather you believe so?
I think there is. I don't think there's a whole lot that's changed since obviously everything happened in 2016. Obviously the candidate is one of them, and one of the things that was the most wrong with Hillary Clinton was her history, her sort of views on certain things, and this insistence on drawing attention away from herself. She just could not stand up to she couldn't stand up to the scrutiny. Biden's got a personality trait that does sort of follow that. If you look at the gaffes that he's made quite recently, forgetting his opponent's name on TV, it's really basic things, and I can't help but think that that's going to hinder him in some voters' minds at least. I don't think the problem for Trump has been the lack of a message as such. I think it's been a lack of an impact in some states and severe failings on the part of both candidates to actually sort of draw attention to their key policies in some states and away from their sort of fallbacks in others. So just going back to Pennsylvania for a second, Trump has come out with a massively pro-fracking message. Pennsylvania is not a state that embraces fracking to the level that he has been sort of pushing it at. So Biden's sort of hesitation on fracking might go down well in Pennsylvania, which is obviously a key swing state. I think Trump's been typically predictable throughout his term in office in terms of his character, in terms of how he doesn't mince his words. I think he's portrayed himself as the strong president, the president that can stand up for America around the world, which was the whole America First message the first time round. And put quite frankly, it's not my sort of preference for either candidate, because I don't really rate either of them, if I'm being honest. But I just don't think he's done enough to lose this time, and I think it's up to Biden really to make up the gap in terms of the Electoral College.
I'll come back in on that. I think you're right in a lot of what you say, Jack. I think though, I wonder though, has the country, the things changed in the last 4 years? And clearly it has. The pandemic has changed, and one of the things that has changed, and no one really knows how it's going to impact, is mail-in voting. We're quite used to postal ballots here, it's part and parcel of elections and things like that. And as Alex pointed out, it's something that I think last Monday, everyone who had voted in, they've now passed everyone who had voted in the 2016 election in terms of mail-in voters. They're seeing the biggest surge ever. How will that actually play out, both in terms of an election, but also it'll be quite interesting even post-election, the polling, whether it captures that or whether we're going to see a kind of a very different slant on election night. And then, of course, you've got this question of, well, where does that lead us? Going back to that question earlier on, if mail-in voting ends up being problematic, are we back into a Bush Gore in the Supreme Court situation? But I think it is a different race than I think anyone would have thought of, let's say, in January.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And if you look at the mail-in voting sort of problems, you've got Supreme Court challenges that have already gone through. And the Supreme Court, even with the Republican majority, even with Trump's anti-mail-in voting position, they've struck down the challenges to it. So if you look at the states where the Republicans are actively trying to cut short the time for counting the mail-in votes to try and maybe increase their own chances, but nobody really knows what impact that's going to have yet. the Supreme Court has actually struck that down. So I think in terms of the mail-in voting, it's going to be basically to say the obvious thing, what the numbers are about, but also it's not going to change too much compared to last time in terms of the method and how the states regulate it. So it is going to be interesting in terms of the numbers increase. But I don't think Trump, I've seen a couple of the comments in the chat as we've been going through, I don't think there will be as big of a controversy at the end of it from Donald Trump if he does end up losing.
If I could just come back in as well, actually, on the question of mail-in voting and absentee voting and early voting generally. I mean, there's been the figures that I've seen show quite a staggering kind of divergence between the voting intention of those people who are intending to turn out and vote on the day, which are probably 2/3 Republican or 2/3 Trump, and those that are voting early or voting by mail, who are a similar kind of proportion in the other direction. I think this is one thing that makes it harder for Trump to, if he's playing catch up and trying to narrow the gap. If the pool of potential switchers is shrinking every day, because obviously more people are voting as we go along, but also within that, he's already to actually get anybody to change their mind and switch to him on the day itself. He's already fishing from a minority of people who are intending to vote on the day. The people that are already voting on the day are basically with him already. It makes it very, very difficult to narrow that gap and to catch up. But he doesn't have to do it everywhere. He doesn't have to do it across the country. He has to do it in particular places, and it is still it's possible. I think, as you said, Alan, 10% chance is still a chance, and still a chance worth throwing everything at, and his supporters and his party workers and so on, and his voters. They absolutely got to give everything they possibly can to try and get over the line. But we were all taken massively by surprise by what happened 4 years ago. And I think we have to be alert and alive to the possibility that we could be taken massively by surprise again. But it doesn't feel like that lightning's going to strike twice. But I guess in a few days' time, well, say in a few days' time we might find out, or not if it ends up protracted legal challenge and so on, then it might be in a few months' time, who knows. But we'll certainly have a clearer idea of where things are heading after Tuesday night, and I hope we'll all be watching with open eyes on election night and seeing how things go. I do love an election night. I mean, obviously it's better if you've got a dog in the fight, and but even if not, I mean, things like the European Parliament elections. I was in France that weekend, and we were watching the French coverage of the European Parliament elections. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. It's just numbers, it's graphs, it's charts, it's all the kind of stuff that even without picking a side, it's really fascinating and exciting and moving, and things are changing. And looking forward to a few drinks and or socially distant drinks on Tuesday night to see how it goes.
Just quickly on the mail-in ballot point, do you think it's been a bit of a flawed strategy on Trump's part to attack the concept? Obviously, electorally, he's hoping that he can kind of whip up some paranoia that he can ride. But obviously, over in the UK, we're kind of taught now, really, we might not like the postal vote system that much, but the reality is it's here, and your best bet of doing well in an election is to actually make sure that your vote is on postal votes, so you don't have this mammoth operation of trying to make sure all your voters remember to turn out on polling day, or, well, not even remember, but people might get caught up at work or something. So do you think he's made a bit of a mistake there to try and do down this system, and rather than just think, well, reality is there's going to be loads of mail-in votes and we need to make sure that as many of ours are also registered?
Yes, I think that there's certainly a degree of absolute truth in that. If you look closer to home, 2012 London mayor election, which again, an election that a lot of us would have been taking part in one way or another, in votes cast on the day, Ken Livingstone was ahead. It was the postal votes that got Boris re-elected. So I know we like to kind of complain about postal votes and fraud and postal vote factories, and we point to certain practices, and no doubt there is a lot of that goes on, but actually the people that postal votes are most convenient for, slightly older demographic or people who might be away, be working. Generally, those are people that are better for us on the right to begin with. So actually, yes, you're absolutely right. Perhaps a better approach is to not complain about the system, but use the system to advantage and get your people signed up for it. And if you have a postal vote, you are far more likely to vote than if you don't. And that cuts across all levels of elections. Because it comes through the door, you send it back, and the turnout for. I think for this election, I think the turnout across the piece is going up and is going to be one of the biggest ever, and that's fine. But in a low turnout election or lower turnout election, then the advantage you can get by having your supporters committed to postal vote is huge. And we will do it. And we before we have local elections, we'll try and get all our pledges signed up. What it does do, though, I think the tactic that he's pursued in by trying to kind of delegitimize the mail-in ballot process is it's almost kind of it's creating a bit of an excuse so if he does lose, then he can say, well, it was the China plague, and it was this, it was that, and it was the fraud, and it was stolen, the election was stolen, and he can kind of without necessarily actually having a platform to challenge it, he can use various things as an excuse to kind of then I was going to say step away quietly. I don't think he'll ever step away quietly from anything. It's not in his nature, but certainly deflect from any blame that could otherwise be placed on him as a candidate in a campaign. But I don't know whether, if he does lose, will he accept the result with the same good grace and decorum that the Democrats have done over the last 4 years? I don't know. We'll see.
I tend to think you and Jack are right. Actually, I think fears of a kind of an attempt by Trump to sit in the White House and delegitimize it is probably overblown. I think in the end, exactly what you say, he'll find, and he might have cause, but he'll find a reason to say this wasn't legitimate, it's not right, but yada yada yada. And he will do things that would be norm breaking. So he may not actually attend the inauguration of a potential new president. There could be lots that he can do between now and election day or inauguration day to that could change the nature of it. But I think Donald Trump is once he has, and I think he didn't. I don't think anyone, even he, really truly believed he was going to win in 2016, and had already spent a lot of time building up. Here's reasons why I lost. I think we're seeing a little bit of that again, because the mail-in thing makes almost no sense. Why from 6 months out you weren't. If you were looking at it as pure campaign strategy or tactics, why you weren't in certain states encouraging people like Florida, which already has high mail-in. And I noticed he did pivot and start talking about, well, Florida's mail-in system is fine, but other states isn't. That would have made a lot of sense to actually say, well, okay, let's lift that and try and apply that even in other counties, even not statewide. And I think you're right. It's always felt more about, if I don't win, this is going to be the reason. And I think, as Jack said, I agree, Jack. I don't think there's going to be there'll be a lot of carping, there'll be a lot of noise, but I think there'll be a lot more light than heat on this. If he doesn't win.
Just quickly, we've got one final question before we wrap up. Try and keep answers brief, but what impact, if any, do you think rioting in certain parts of America has had on the election, and do you think that's favoured a particular candidate and their message one way or the other? Any of you?
Yeah, I'll go first. I think it's amazing to think what went on over the summer, that President Trump tried this law and order line that didn't seem to kind of catch traction. And what we have seen is, again, and I think this is actually going back to what I was saying earlier on, I think Biden has played these things very well, because he hasn't let them become big issues. He hasn't engaged in a culture war. He's almost taken every opportunity each time to step back away and keep the focus on the president. He hasn't looked to try and create a new, he's managed to keep the far left on side while still holding ground in a fairly centrist position. And so I think during the summer, I thought this is actually a game changer. We may see huge changes in how both candidates operate. But I think through Biden pulling away from it and President Trump not following through on it, it seems to have just dissipated as a campaign issue. You don't hear it being coming up on voters' concerns. Again, the voters' concerns seem to be about coronavirus and the economy.
Yeah, I think I agree with much of that. I think when it was all kind of kicking off, I expected it to have quite a big impact because it was pretty dramatic in certain places and how things were going. But it hasn't really seemed to have an impact on voting intention on polls. I mean, you go back to the earlier slides it showed where the national polling position has basically been static for the last I don't know 6 months, which surprises me. You'd have expected some kind of flicker with something as big as this happening, but it hasn't. And whether you accept the polls being in the right level to begin with or not, or whether there's an underestimation or an overestimate, you would still expect if something was having an impact, you would expect to see some movement. And we haven't seen any movement. Nothing has shifted the dial, whether it's the rioting, law and order, whether it's news about the economy, one way or the other, and the performance in the debates. I mean, the first debate, I think was well, I don't know how many of us watched it, but it was a bit of a car crash. I think it showed both candidates in their both. It showed the worst qualities of both candidates in extremis. I mean, Trump did come across as quite kind of aggressive and rude and belligerent. He did get some very good attack lines, or he got a lot of his attack lines in quite successfully. But his general demeanour was not very positive. And Biden did kind of look a bit like a rabbit in the headlights, which is what I fear he'll be when he becomes president, or if he becomes president. But none of that has shifted anything one way or the other, which is interesting. I mean, you see recent election campaigns over here. 2017 is an example of when the campaign made a huge difference, and the polling position and the polling position, and then ultimately the result at the end of the campaign were very different indeed. So campaigns and events can make a huge difference, but on this occasion it seems that we've just kind of, whatever's been going on as a backdrop, had this kind of inexorable kind of just trudge along to the result that nobody's going to be particularly enthusiastic about. I mean, even those people that support Biden, they're not really supporting Biden. They're against Trump. It's going to be a fairly turgid administration, and then we'll see. I mean, the other question is that what is the future for the Republican Party post Trump? Who are the leading lights going to be? What's the messaging, the approach, and how they? I mean, that's perhaps a discussion for a whole new webinar in 6 months' time, 18 months' time. Who knows? But yeah.
I think that's
Mitt Romney seems to have positioned himself for a comeback, doesn't he?
I think it's a decent sentiment to end on, really. I think Donald Trump has sort of swept in for the 2016 election with, well, leaving nothing behind him. And we're seeing now the Republican Party actually scrambling to try and see, well, who's next? And you've got obviously the Mitch McConnells, you've got the Kevin McCarthy's in the House, but their Senate and House careers respectively are nowhere near over if you look at their intentions. So it is going to be difficult to see who can replace Trump when he's gone. My sentiment over Biden is that you're not really electing Biden, I don't think. He's 78. I know Trump's 74 as well, but there is a chance, however small, that you're effectively electing Kamala Harris. And I think this is what the Trump campaign has tried to play on. It's been an element of fear that you're not getting what you're voting for. There's in certain districts as well, going back to the rioting, there's rioting in the streets. Trump has tried to portray this image of law and order, which I don't really know whether, well, we're not on the ground. We don't really know whether that's hit home or not, but the polls certainly don't suggest that it has. Looking at the individual districts, there are a lot of districts that are significantly under 20,000 majority that tend to switch by election almost. I just want to draw attention to two in particular. There's one in Utah that has been Republican since 2015. It has a 694 Democrat majority from the 2018 midterms. And these are hundreds of thousands of people voting. District 6 in Georgia is under 3,500 majority Democrat after they gained it from the Republicans. District 7 is a 419 majority. So it has to be, for me, the effect of the message on the ground in these individual districts, not just to tip the House, but maybe the race as well for president, because you've got to incorporate these groups, the suburbs, the inner cities. These groups make up individual districts, and you've got to make sure that you appeal to the right number of them and the right type of them to effectively make your way to the White House. I think it's going to largely depend on that.
Thank you, Jack. Right, we are at time now, but before, I'm just going to ask a really quick fire question, the dreaded one. What percentage chance do you assign Donald Trump of pulling off another 2016 and winning next Tuesday? Alex?
Let's say 10%.
10%. Okay. Alan? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, about the same. I think 10% is about right.
10%. Jack, are you going to be?
I don't think it's likely. Probably about the same. Yeah, 10%.
Wow. No one's predicting a Trump victory. Oh, God. Well, that concludes tonight's event. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. A huge thank you to you, Alex. I really do appreciate you giving your time both to talk to us tonight and prepare that fascinating presentation with oodles of data, both historic and polling. Really interesting and very good to hear your expert opinion on this. And obviously, Alan and Jack, thank you to you for joining us as well.
Thanks.
Thank you.